What are the chances that Drake London wins the Triple Crown and becomes the NFL's highest paid wide receiver?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we will be giving the latest on the Kirk Cousins, now that the Steelers have found their quarterback, as well as talk about the latest Kyle Pitts rumors that is also Steelers adjacent. We'll talk about how and why the Falcons' future plans kind of hinge all on their 2025 success. But first, guys, we got to talk about Drake.
Drake? Yes!
Yes, Drake, because NFL.com dropped an article this past week called the All-Paid Team of Tomorrow, looking at various players across each position group that are in line for big money contracts, potentially market resetting deals, and several Falcons made the cut, including Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts, Jesse Bates, along with the player we're going to focus on today, which is Drake London. And, those other players, we might have future discussions later this week on the podcast about their futures, long-term financial futures in Atlanta. But to me, Drake deserves the bulk of the conversation because he stood out when his projection for what his average per year could be on his contract after this season, as we've speculated, this offseason that Drake is due to get paid next offseason, is $40+ million, according to this NFL.com all-paid team of tomorrow breakdown. And is there a chance that Drake could get that type of price tag? It's definitely possible, but to me, the way that he would have to do so is essentially win the Triple Crown, right? Jamar Chase is currently the only wide receiver in the NFL that earns $40+ million per year on his contract. And what did Jamar Chase do to earn that contract? He won the Triple Crown last year, leading the league in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. And when we have the conversation about who's the best wide receiver in the NFL, that conversation, I think most people will pick either Chase or Justin Jefferson. And basically what I'm sitting here saying is, in order for Drake London to earn that type of money, I think he has to make it a three-horse race, so to speak, after this season with the type of season he could have in 2025. And I think while Drake London is a very good wide receiver, PFF most recently ranked him as the 11th best wide receiver in the NFL, which I think is fair for him. He's probably somewhere, depending on where you feel about Drake, somewhere between like 8 and 18 in terms of wide receiver rankings. I still think there's a considerable leap that Drake is going to have to make this upcoming season in order to be top 3 in terms of being the top wide receiver in the league. And when we look at the highest paid wide receivers, Jamar Chase tops that list, averaging $40.25 million. That's followed by Justin Jefferson at $35 million. And I think realistically, the range for Drake London in terms of where he could be entering the conversation is the next tier down, right? And that's the CeeDee Lamb area, where he's averaging about $34 million a year. DK Metcalf, $33 million a year. AJ Brown, $32. Amon-Ra St. Brown is $30. Tyreek Hill is $30. Brandon Ayuk is $30. And then, of course, T. Higgins and Jalen Waddle being the top two, number 2 wide receivers, both making north of $28 million a year. And I think the realistic range for Drake is going to be that $30 to $34 million range, based off of what type of season he could wind up having. But if he does shoot up into the next tax bracket, what type of production would we need to see from Drake London? I went back and looked at all the various wide receivers that over the last 5 years have either led the league in targets, catches, yards, or touchdowns, and looked at the averages. And Drake has a considerable leap that he's going to have to make in that group. And the average of those league leading receivers in catches averaged about 132 catches. That's about 30 more than what Drake had last year. All right. In receiving yards, it was over 1,700 yards. That's about 500 more than what Drake had last year. In targets, they averaged about 180 targets, 179 to be exact. That's about 20 more than what Drake had last year. And in terms of touchdowns, those guys averaged about 16 touchdowns per year. And that's 7 more than what Drake had last year, almost double the amount of touchdowns that he had. And I also looked at sort of the number 2 wide receivers that played alongside those guys that were league leading NFL wide receivers to sort of see, were these guys benefiting from basically being the sole breadwinner in their offense? And in some cases that was true with Devontae Adams, with Mac Hollins, and Cooper Kupp with Van Jefferson, notably 2 former Falcons here on this list. But I looked at the average for, those 7 number 2s, including T. Higgins with Jamar Chase, and Jake Ferguson for CeeDee Lamb, and Jalen Waddle for Tyreek Hill, and Adam Thielen for Justin Jefferson, and Cole Beasley, going back to Stephon Diggs' league-leading season with the 2020 Bills, and looked at their averages across those last 5 years. And they average about 55 catches, over 700 yards, and 3 touchdowns, right? Which is not necessarily elite number 2 wide receiver production. But when you extrapolate that to a full 17-game season, because these guys on average only played about 15 games, which was contributing to these numbers for the number 1 guy, those numbers, those per 17-game averages, look very similar to what Darnell Mooney had last year, right? On average, those guys had about 104 targets. Mooney had 106, right? On average, those guys had 62 catches. Mooney had 64. On average, they had 4 touchdowns. Mooney had 5. Now, the big difference was in the yards. The number 2 wide receivers averaged about 802 yards per 17 games. Mooney had 992. So about 200 yards difference when it came to those guys. And I also looked at how often these teams were running the football compared to the NFL averages, right? And a lot of these teams were very much pass-heavy offenses. On average, these 7 teams that had these league-leading wide receivers over the last 5 years ran the ball about 40% of the time. The league average pretty consistently over the last 5 seasons has been somewhere between 41 and 43% of the time. And the average ranking for these teams would roughly correspond to being like basically a 22nd, 23rd ranked offense when it came to how often they ran the football. And that contrasts with the Falcons, who, ran almost 46% of the time last year, above the league average of 43%. And so to me, the type of offenses that run the ball only 40% of the time, right? The Bears were that team last year that ran the ball about 40% of the time, but you look at other teams that ran between 39 and 41% last year. You have Carolina, Miami, Kansas City, Houston, the Giants, Dallas. I wouldn't describe any of these offenses as quote unquote healthy, right? These tend to be a little bit more one-dimensional. A lot of these teams tend to play with bad defenses, and so are forced to throw the ball a lot more. And so to me, basically, I'm sitting here saying is that if the Falcons are throwing the ball enough, that's going to allow Drake London to pad his numbers in this way, that's not a good sign. And so to me, when I look at it in terms of the reality where Drake London is putting up the type of production that we're talking about him potentially putting up in order to, merit a $40 million a year contract, that to me is the reality where a lot of things went wrong. Either Darnell Mooney got hurt for a large stretch of the season, and so therefore, the Falcons had to funnel their offense through Drake London. He was getting 15, 20 targets in those games. Or the Falcons defense is so terrible that they had to play from behind constantly and are forced to throw the ball a lot. That was basically what Cincinnati was last year, where they only ran the ball about 35% of the time, not because they had a bad run game. Numbers I've seen say that they were roughly league average in terms of running the football, but because their defense was so terrible that they were constantly playing from behind. And so to me, I still basically what I'm sitting here saying is I hope that Drake London, as productive as I want Drake London to be, I hope that level of production is not to the level that some of these guys that were league leaders, Triple Crown winners, et cetera, were these last couple of years, because that to me is not a good sign for the future of the Falcons, especially with a young quarterback where you do want to run the football to take pressure off of your young quarterback to have to sort of handle things. This offensive line isn't really built, to be dropping back and throwing the ball, that as often as some of these offenses are doing and whatnot. And so, hopefully Drake London will not win the Triple Crown is basically what I'm getting at, and will have a good season, be the alpha in a very good offense that may merit, $33-34 million a year, possibly challenging Justin Jefferson as that number 2 guy at $35 million plus. I'm expecting Drake to earn more north of $30 million, but hopefully it's in that 30, 33, $34 million range. I think is probably a more realistic projection. It's just a question to me of how much more over $30 million does Drake earn this upcoming season. And so that's going to be something that we'll have to pay attention to, but we will leave the numbers aside and look ahead to this upcoming season and talk a lot about why this season is so important, and sort of ask the question of what happens if Drake doesn't earn that type of big time contract extension, this time next year. And sort of that gets us into a conversation of why so much of the Falcons' future plans kind of hinge on this upcoming season and being successful this upcoming season. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, sometimes you guys look at your bank account. I know I do sometimes, and wonder, like, where did all my money go? Whether it's dining out, online shopping, entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And especially this time of year when you want to have that extra money in your pocket so that when you head to the beach or go on vacation or take the kids or wherever you're doing this summer, you want to have that money. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO that's going to give you full visibility and control over your finances all summer long. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, spending all in one place, and even plan those long-term or short-term summer goals so that you can stop managing your money and start building wealth. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. So I asked the question, what happens if Drake doesn't earn this big contract extension, whether you think that's $30 million or $40 million, right? Whether that's due to injury, whether that's due to inconsistency. Again, I think we're on that path, but it's not necessarily, out of the realm of possibility where, we're not having that conversation about paying Drake this time next year. The good thing is that Drake is still under contract with that 5th year option that the Falcons extended this offseason, keeps him under contract through the 2026 season. And that will give him another opportunity to earn the big time extension that we're talking about. And even if he hits the open market in 2027, the Falcons will have the flexibility to franchise tag him. But that's also the same offseason where the Falcons could, in theory, decide to give Bijan Robinson a big time contract extension. When you look at the timeline over basically since the new CBA was signed in 2011, the Falcons have consistently established a timeline where they like to pay their first round picks before their 5th year begins. You saw that with Julio Jones back in 2015, Desmond Trufant in 2017, Jake Matthews the following year. Then there was a couple of years where things didn't go quite according to plan. Because of first round picks not getting those extensions, but then they got back on that timeline with Chris Lindstrom in 23, AJ Terrell last year. This was supposed to be the Kyle Pitts offseason. Unfortunately, Kyle Pitts didn't earn that type of money, but next year Drake is in line. Then it's going to be Bijan. Then it's going to be Penix. Then in 2029, it's going to be Jalen Walker and or James Pierce. And so, I know this brings up the concern a lot of people have, like the Falcons should be not waiting until the 5th years, but instead paying these guys, after 3 years when they first become eligible, and therefore they would save money. And I think that's a fair, thing to believe, because it's not certainly false, but I also think people tend to overestimate how much money teams can save. Like sometimes you can save a lot of money, sometimes you don't save that much money. Like when we're talking about, at least with Drake, like, to me, when we're talking about like the 3-year payouts in terms of guaranteed money in the price range that Drake is already kind of in, if the Falcons wanted to sign him this offseason, like it would be like, oh, well, we're only going to give him $90 million over the next 3 years. Versus if we wait a year, we might have to give him $100 million over the next 3 years. And it's like, okay, that $10 million isn't necessarily breaking your back or whatever. But, a team like the Eagles are one of those teams that consistently pays guys early. But I think the Eagles also benefit by being able to get away with that, because they're also a team that's very aggressive when it comes to restructuring and moving money around. And of course, the bigger factor is the Eagles get away with that because they win games, right? Which is the key, right? Whatever strategy you have is a good strategy if it results in winning games. And, that's why when we sit here and we have this vision for the bright future ahead for this Atlanta Falcons team, when we're talking about Drake London being one of the top wide receivers, highest paid, Bijan being the top running back, Michael Penix, 3 years in, earning a big time contract extension for a quarterback and whatnot. And we have this really strong, young core of players in the primes of their careers for the next 3 to 5 years, a perennial top 5 offense. And then in that time, you're also kind of rebuilding the defense, adding more talent there, potentially revamping the offensive line, particularly at the offensive tackle position. And sort of like you can sit there and see the vision of like, hey, all this comes together for the Atlanta Falcons and there's a bright future ahead for this franchise. But you can also squint and see the vision that, that things start to fall apart if this team doesn't win. And so it begs the question, what happens if this team doesn't reach their goals of having, a winning record or a playoff berth, whatever you think is that goal here in 2025? There's a real possibility of the general manager and the head coach getting fired and someone else is going to come in here with a brand new vision. And that vision may not necessarily include, let's make Drake London one of the, 5 to 7 highest paid wide receivers in the NFL, at least out the gates, right? That's a possibility, right? And, when we talk about Drake London, like as good as Drake London is, and he's very good, right? One of the 10 to 15 best wide receivers in the NFL, he's also not that explosive. And there's a possibility if the Falcons bring in a different coaching staff, they may value explosiveness a little bit more, right? That when you look at Drake London's explosive numbers, right, he's much more in line with like the Chris Godwins and whatnot that are making like $22-25 million a year, as opposed to the guys that are making 30-35 million a year. And so, we'll have to sort of see on that. But, if you're Drake London on the flip side, right, are you necessarily going to be that quick to sign on a dotted line if the Falcons come to you next offseason with a new contract offer, especially if you don't reach your goals this upcoming season, right? Are you going to be that interested in signing a long-term deal in Atlanta if the team doesn't win this year, right? At that point, you will have 4 years in Atlanta with 0 playoff berths. And if you're in Drake London's shoes, are you going to be that, I know I'm talking to people that are fans that are like, yes, absolutely. I'll be committed to the Atlanta Falcons. But, for those of you that can, take your Homer glasses off and think about it from another person's perspective, like, would you be that willing to commit long-term to a team, having not played a single snap under, in this scenario, a new coaching staff because the Falcons failed to reach their goals this year? Right? Why not bet on yourself and see what happens in 2026 and see how it unfolds after that point? Right. This is one of the reasons why we were down on the Belichick hire a year, 18 months ago or however long it was, 16 months ago, I guess it was. Because like the idea behind Belichick was like Belichick was going to come in here and blow this whole thing up and not probably stick around long enough to sort of see a rebuild through. But basically, if the Falcons don't have that success this year, again, whether that's, having a winning record or making the playoffs, whatever you think that is, there's a potential that you might as well take that approach next year with the next coaching hire, potentially, right? What's stopping that regime from blowing it up? Because it's clearly not working for the Atlanta Falcons at this point in time. And again, I don't say all that to be doom and gloom or whatever, but it just is so reminiscent to me of the conversation that we were having, around this time 5 years ago in the summer of 2021 or 2020, where we talked about then the pressure to win under Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff going into a make or break year and the consequences that could happen if the team didn't, right? The immediate ones were, Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff's dismissal. But we also talked about the significant ramifications for a lot of the players that a lot of people just assume, oh, we'll just bring in a new coach and new GM and they'll keep all the same players and we'll just keep running it back with Julio Jones and Matt Ryan. And, we know that didn't happen with with Julio Jones, and it quickly sort of started unraveling with Matt Ryan. That was something that we talked about in, the summer of 2020, that there are consequences and repercussions to losing football games. And those same, things apply potentially to Drake London and Bijan Robinson and Michael Penix and some of these other core players that we just sort of automatically assume are going to play another decade plus here in Atlanta. And again, it's not to say that it all hinges on this upcoming season, but, it's a lot about the momentum, right? And potentially later this week, we're going to have a conversation about Jesse Bates' future, where that NFL.com article mentions a possible extension for Jesse Bates. But like if the Falcons miss, the playoff for a third time in a row in Jesse Bates' time here in Atlanta, how eager is he going to be to sign a long-term deal to stick around potentially if his goal is to win football games and whatnot. And so ultimately, it just reemphasizes the point that winning is everything. It's what's going to keep the decision makers that make these football decisions, whether to sign these guys to contract extensions, employed. And it also gives players incentive to actually sign these contract extensions because they want to stick around long term. And so basically winning is what gives you that momentum to say that, hey, we're on the right path and we just got to keep building this path in the years to come, or else if you don't win, then someone else is going to come in and be like, I don't think you're on the right path, and we're going to blow this whole thing up and go in a different direction. And so we'll see, where the path takes the Atlanta Falcons this upcoming season. But that whole, need to win element is, related to the Kirk Cousins and Kyle Pitts trade rumors and discussions, because trading both of those guys doesn't really help you win in 2025. But let's break down the latest trade rumors with both of those players as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So maybe you haven't heard, right? We got a specific team that called about Kyle Pitts. There were reports on May 30th when Jordan Schultz put out that multiple teams have called the Falcons. Well, we found out one specific team called the Falcons, according to Ian Rappaport, who reported last week that the Steelers were a team that made a call about Kyle Pitts. And of course, speaking of the Steelers, they also signed Aaron Rodgers, which, impacts Kirk Cousins' trade value, because just like the Joe Flacco signing with the Cleveland Browns and a Russell Wilson signing with the New York Giants this offseason pretty much kills our last spot for Kirk Cousins to earn a starting job going into this summer, which we know is what Kirk wants in order to waive his no trade clause in a potential trade. And so, the fact that the Steelers called about Kyle Pitts isn't a surprise. Again, multiple teams were reported to call the Falcons 10 days ago. And, I think most people probably would assume Pittsburgh was going to be one of those teams, given the Arthur Smith connection, given the fact that reportedly the Steelers have made a lot of phone calls since the draft to add more pass catchers to their offense. And so, if you were struggling to connect the dots, well, the dots are connected for you when it comes to that sort of thing. And of course, when it comes to the Steelers and Aaron Rodgers, the writing was on the wall like 2 months ago. Shout out to my guy, Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers, basically been saying since at least mid-March that it's inevitable that Rodgers is going to sign with the Steelers. But I know there was a lot of Falcon fans that were still holding out hope that, they were going to, not get the deal done. And, that would open up the door for the Steelers to come calling for Kirk Cousins. But, this doesn't mean a whole lot for the Falcons if you haven't been reading the tea leaves over the last several months, like with Pitts being moved and not being moved. And that clearly he's not going to get moved. And the same thing with Kirk Cousins. And, it goes back to the conversation we just had where it's just like, there's really no incentive for the Falcons to try to move these guys at this point in time, because it's not going to help you win games. And it's very important that this team wins games this upcoming season for some of the reasons that we talked about. We've already seen that this team is not that committed to the, life beyond 2025 with their trading away 2026 draft picks, like the 1st and 5th round pick that they traded on draft weekend in that 2026 draft. And so, there's really no incentive for the Falcons to try to move off of these guys. And, it goes back to, Pitts, that 3rd round pick in 2026 that you would seemingly acquire at this point, right? Your incentive to trade Pitts was before the draft, so that in theory you could get something in return that would help you win games this year. But that's not the case anymore now that the draft is gone, right? 2026 pick is not going to help you win in 2025. And, with Kirk Cousins, we've said since March that Terry Fontenot's mantra in regards to Kirk Cousins is I'm leaving here with something. And that's something at this point in time is very unlikely to be draft picks or cap space, as so many people were hoping it would be by trading Kirk. It's most likely going to be potentially wins, because we don't spend that much time talking about it. But, Michael Penix does have an extensive injury history from his college days. And so you may need a functional number 2 quarterback in order to win games should he miss time this upcoming season. And despite the fact that, Easton Stick is a winner, right, because he's a 4-time national champion at the collegiate level, I think most of us would agree that even as low as you may be on Kirk Cousins, you probably have a little bit more confidence in Kirk Cousins' ability to come off the bench and win a football game in the potential absence of Michael Penix than you do Easton Stick at this point in time, because after all, Easton Stick was replaced by Taylor Heineke last year. And I know how many of you guys feel about Taylor Heineke, at least here in Atlanta. It's different in the DC metro area, but in Atlanta, not so much for Taylor Heineke's hometown team. But, we'll see what's what with these guys. The math may change with both of these guys as far as trades later this summer as we get into the season, where the Falcons price tag or asking price will go down, or teams are going to be a little bit more aggressive, upping their offer due to injuries and whatnot. So that's really where we're at this point in time. And we'll just sort of have to see if, Pitts and Cousins help this team win in 2025. Is that a guarantee? No. Right. I've said long held that this Falcons offense has more potential with Kyle Pitts on the roster than it does without him on the roster. But we'll have to sort of see if Kyle Pitts lives up to the hype. We'll have to sort of see if Zach Robinson's going to make more effort to try to get more out of him, give him more opportunities, and will Kyle Pitts take advantage of those opportunities? And of course, we'll see what happens with Kirk Cousins. And Michael Penix this upcoming season. So we'll have to sort of see on that. But until it does, we're not going to spend that much time, speculating on trade rumors is basically the reason why I'm bringing this up. But hey, every now and then we got to talk about it. So, basically what I'm sitting here saying is until the math changes on this thing and something happens where we can feel like, okay, the Falcons offer or asking price is going to take a significant dip, or other teams are going to be a lot more aggressive in terms of upping their offer. Probably not going to spend that much time anymore talking about the possibility of Kyle Pitts and Kirk Cousins trades this summer. So, it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of more interesting things to talk about, including, to me, things that matter, like, is this team going to win games? And, does that mean Drake London's going to make, 32, 34, or $38 million next year on his next contract extension? I can't speak for you guys, but clearly I'm a little bit more invested in that because of what it means for what happens this season and the future of this football team, as opposed to two players that are just on borrowed time here in Atlanta in Kyle Pitts and Kirk Cousins as things look ahead. But, we'll have some guests on that may feel like, Kyle Pitts has more potential to stick around long-term here in Atlanta beyond 2025, and that will be potentially in store for you later this week. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. We should be back with one of those guests, including JP Acosta, who covers the NFL for SB Nation. Recently broke down his thoughts on Michael Penix. We'll get his thoughts on that, as well as, what this Falcons 2025 season outlook looks like. Are they going to be able to, deliver on all our wishes and dreams of, finally getting a winner this year? Or is it going to be just more of the same? So we'll pick JP's brain on that tomorrow. So continue to make Locked On Falcons by subscribing or following on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, where at least Kyle Krabs, I know, has been speculating on Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts trade. So you can get that information, as well as, Kyle and Joe giving you that information to get you guys geared up for this year's training camps and upcoming season, and making you the most informed fan that you can possibly be. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.